Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding some fascinating research, a really deep analysis of the miracles you read about in the Gospels.
Yeah, we're going beyond just, listing what happened.
Exactly. We're diving into sources that meticulously categorize and compare Jesus' acts against, well, the whole backdrop of Old Testament prophecy.
Right. And we're not just summarizing the stories here. We're looking at a key argument that comes out of this data.
Yeah.
The sources basically say Jesus's actions weren't just powerful, they showed a unique kind of authority.
Unique how?
An authority that was fundamentally different from Elijah or Elisha or any prophet before him. And this difference, it's largely based on what those earlier prophets simply didn't do, what they couldn't do.
Okay, let's cut right to the core finding then. The thing that really shapes this whole deep dive, there's a statistical analysis the sources did, and that's the key, isn't it?
Absolutely. They looked at 35 distinct miracle events recorded across the Gospels.
35. Okay.
And their conclusion is, well, pretty stunning. 80% of those events had no specific precedent in the Old Testament.
80%. Wow, that 80-20 split, that's kind of the theological earthquake we need to unpack here.
It really is. That ratio suggests these acts weren't just, random displays of power. They were deliberate signposts.
So if 20% show a connection to tradition,
Right. Then the other 80% show something completely new, a different level of divine authority, you could say. The question that sources are really digging into is, what kind of authority is this?
and if we want to get our heads around the sheer shock these events must have caused, culturally, religiously, we have to start where the sources do, with what they call the prophetic barometer. Let's focus on one type of healing that apparently prophets before Jesus never did, restoring sight. Why was healing the blind such a big deal, such a unique act?
Well, when you look back at the really mighty acts of the prophets, and we're talking raising the dead, healing leprosy, multiplying food, big stuff.
Yeah, incredible things.
Incredible things. But there's this noticeable gap in the record. There isn't a single recorded instance anywhere in the Old Testament of a prophet healing someone born blind, or even just restoring sight that was lost.
That absence is really loud then, isn't it?
It is. Because healing the blind, it was understood as something reserved for God alone. It was woven into prophecies about Israel's ultimate restoration, a sign of the coming Messianic age.
Okay.
Our sources point again and again to texts like Psalm 46, verse 8, which says, point blank, "The Lord opens the eyes of the blind." It attributes that power solely to God.
And Isaiah 35 too, right? That promise of renewal. It says, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped."
Exactly.
So put yourself in the shoes of a religious leader back then, someone totally steeped in the Torah, the prophets. The moment Jesus heals the man born blind, like in John chapter 9, you're not just seeing a medical miracle.
No, not at all.
You're seeing this undeniable, maybe even terrifying theological claim that this man is operating with God's own power, fulfilling these incredibly specific, powerful national prophecies.
They literally had no historical box to put it in, except the one labeled Messianic fulfillment.
Okay, let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture, the data that supports this idea. The sources looked at 35 distinct events.
That's right, 35. And they specifically excluded the resurrection and the transfiguration. They sort of put those in a separate category, self-revelation.
Makes sense. So focusing just on the miracles, the displays of power, what did the overall breakdown look like?
Well, the biggest category by far was healings. That was 18 events, just over half, 51.4%.
Okay.
Then the next two big groups, which were basically unprecedented, were exorcisms and power over nature. Each of those had 6 events, so about 17% each.
Right.
And the rest were resurrections, 3 events there, and provision, like multiplying food, which had 2 events.
Now, this is really crucial for understanding the argument. We need to pull out that 20% that did match the old prophetic pattern. The sources only found 7 events like that. Why was it important that he did those too?
That 20%, that's the continuity piece. It establishes that the person doing these new, unique things is also operating with the same kind of power as the most respected figures in their history, like Elijah and Elisha.
Ah, okay. It connects him to the tradition.
Exactly. So the 7 comparable events included 2 healings of leprosy, which directly mirrors Elisha healing Naaman.
Right.
2 miracles of provision, providing food, again, just like Elisha multiplying the loaves, and 3 resurrections, which puts him squarely on the level of Elijah and Elisha, who both raised the dead. That's the peak of Old Testament power, really.
So the argument goes, the 20% proves he's at least as great as the greatest prophets, but the other 80%, That proves he's something else entirely.
Precisely.
Which means 28 events had no Old Testament parallel at all. That remaining 80%, that's where the theological earthquake really happens.
That's it. Those 28 events break down into 16 unique types of healings. Things like healing the blind, the paralyzed, conditions no prophet had healed, plus the 6 exorcisms and the 6 miracles demonstrating power over nature. These are the categories that really define his unique authority according to these sources.
Okay, so let's pivot then and look at how these unprecedented categories, the exorcisms, the power over nature, the unique healings and authority claims, how they work together to make this singular theological point. Let's start with power over nature. 6 events where creation itself seemed to obey him.
That's a key distinction the sources make. When Old Testament prophets interacted with nature, think Moses parting the Red Sea, they always mediated God's power. They prayed, they followed instructions. Jesus, though, he commands nature directly, as if he has inherent authority over it.
Can you give us an example that really shows that difference? Command versus mediation.
The calming of the storm in Mark chapter 4 is probably the clearest example. Jesus is asleep in the boat. This massive storm kicks up. The disciples, who are experienced fishermen, are genuinely panicking.
Right.
Jesus just wakes up and, without praying or calling on God, he just rebukes the wind and says to the waves, "Quiet, be still."
Just speaks to it directly.
Directly. And the disciples' reaction tells you everything. They immediately ask each other, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. That question shows they recognize this wasn't just prophetic power. This was mastery over chaos itself, something they associated only with God, the Creator.
And it wasn't just about controlling destructive forces, was it? What about the display of glory?
Well, think about turning water into wine,
Yeah.
John chapter 2. The sources really emphasize this wasn't done out of need, like Elisha multiplying food so people wouldn't starve.
No, it was a wedding feast.
Exactly. It was done, John explicitly says, to reveal his glory and so his disciples would believe in him. It was like an act of creation itself, making something instantly perfect and new, purely a sign of who he was.
And tied into that divine nature, walking on water in Matthew 14. I mean, that just breaks all the rules, doesn't it?
Completely. And it even leads to him using the divine name I am, ego eimi in the Greek, to calm them down when they think he's a ghost. So these 6 acts involving nature, they consistently push the question way beyond just, is he a prophet?
Okay, then we move to the exorcisms. Authority over the unseen world. The sources say this was, what, completely new territory.
They use terms like unheard of for the prophets. Yes, prophets dealt with illness, maybe even things attributed to spirits, but this direct, authoritative command over demonic entities, sometimes legions of them, that was a dramatic, maybe even frightening shift.
It showed immediate, absolute authority, didn't it? When he cast out the legion in Mark 5, that wasn't just healing one person.
No, it was like a military display. Total command over this huge demonic force, restoring the man completely, showing mastery over the deepest kind of spiritual bondage.
And this command, it had immediate theological weight, too.
Definitely. The sources connect it straight to the arrival of the Messianic age. When Jesus healed that blind and mute man who was demon-possessed in Matthew 12, his statement right after is the crucial claim. If I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you.
Okay, so the exorcism wasn't just proof of power.
It was proof that the promised time, the kingdom, was actually breaking in.
Yeah.
Right then and there.
Right. Let's finish with those 16 unique healings then. You said these weren't just routine healings, they often served another purpose.
Yeah, often these specific healings became the setup, almost the pretext for some of his most controversial claims about who he was, his identity.
Okay, like what?
What the classic example the sources highlight is the healing of the paralyzed man in Mark chapter 2. The man's lowered through the roof, right in front of everyone.
Yeah.
And before Jesus even mentions his paralysis, he looks at him and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven."
Which is, well, that's the really provocative part, isn't it? He throws down this theological gauntlet before the miracle.
Absolutely. The source analysis really points us out. It seems deliberate, done specifically, as Jesus himself says later in the story, to prove his authority to forgive sins on earth. The physical healing becomes the visible proof for the invisible, much bigger claim.
And it forces the scribes, the religious experts, to immediately think, wait a minute, who can forgive sins but God alone?
Exactly. The miracle becomes the tangible evidence backing up the highest possible claim about his identity.
And the strategic use of miracles, tying them to identity, it even extended to challenging Jewish law itself, right? Like the healing of the man with the withered hand, Mark chapter 3, done deliberately on the Sabbath.
Right. The religious leaders are watching him. basically daring him to break the Sabbath rules.
Setting a trap.
Pretty much. And Jesus performs the healing anyway, almost as a preemptive move to establish his authority over the law itself. And then he drives it home by declaring, "The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
Wow. In a culture where the Sabbath was so central, claiming lordship over it, that's basically claiming divine authority to interpret or even set aside the law.
It's an assertion of ultimate legislative authority, yes.
It's clear then, these unique acts, this 80%, they consistently force people, witnesses, disciples, opponents, to grapple with that question. Who is this? The sheer uniqueness demanded a reaction. Astonishment. Confusion.
And you hear that astonishment right in the gospel accounts themselves, the quotes the sources pull out. After that first exorcism in Capernaum, Mark records the people saying, "Is this a new teaching?" And with authority, he even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him.
That word "new" jumps out, doesn't it? They recognize this wasn't following the old script.
Exactly. And you see it again after the healing of the paralytic. "We have never seen anything like this." That line, it perfectly sums up the impact of that unique 80%. It was just outside their frame of reference, religiously, culturally. And maybe the most profound reaction is when the act connects directly back to those national hopes. After he healed the deaf and mute man, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy, they exclaimed, Mark 7:37. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. This constant uniqueness kept raising the messianic question, forcing it out into the open.
Yeah, the sources show the crowds were actually debating it publicly, asking things like, John 7:31, when the Messiah comes, will he perform more signs than this man?
Right, or that question after the healing of the blind and mute demoniac in Matthew 12, could this be the son of David? Which is, the direct prophesied title for the Messiah.
So the data really builds a strong case here.
It does. The statistical breakdown, combined with the specific unprecedented nature of 80% of these acts, especially healing the blind, commanding nature, casting out demons with authority, it all supports the source's main point. Jesus operated with a unique divine authority, fundamentally different from anyone before him, and strategically fulfilling specific messianic prophecies while doing it.
So the key takeaway for you, listening, is that the kind of miracle, the category it fell into, was often just as important, maybe even more important, than the miracle itself. These weren't random, they were deliberate signs, structured to systematically challenge how people understood God and his power.
Which brings us to that final thought we wanted to leave you with, something connecting that 80% and the 20%. Remember, while 80% of the miracles were unprecedented, 3 types, resurrection, provision, and cleansing lepers, deliberately mirrored the absolute peak miracles of Elijah and Elisha.
Right, the 20% continuity.
So here's the question. What does it suggest about this unique authority when it also makes a point of intentionally mirroring historical authority, when it proves mastery over the old prophetic tradition before establishing the completely new?
It suggests maybe a deliberate statement, both fulfilling the past and radically transcending it at the same time.
Something like that. Fulfillment and transcendence side by side. It's definitely something to think about.